Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, finding comfort in these stories as you drift off into the night. Before you get too comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It really means the world to me to know you're out there, listening. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us share these stories with even more people. Now let's get comfortable, take a deep breath, relax, and dive into tonight's case. The Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California have always held a certain rugged beauty. Towering pines stretch toward endless skies. Crystal clear streams cut through valleys where the air smells of earth and wildflowers. In 1981, the small resort community of Keddie was tucked into this wilderness like a secret, quiet, isolated, peaceful. Keddie wasn't much more than a handful of cabins, a small lodge, a post office, and a railroad stop. It was the kind of place where people went to escape the noise of the city, escape their troubles, escape into the simplicity of mountain life. For Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old mother of five, presented exactly that, a fresh start. She had recently separated from her husband James Sharp and moved her children from Connecticut all the way across the country to California. It wasn't an easy decision. Uprooting five kids, John, 15, Sheila, 14, Ricky, 10, and Greg, 5, was no small feat. But Sue was determined. She wanted safety, she wanted peace. She wanted her children to grow up away from the tension and conflict that had plagued their family life. Cabin 28 became their home. It was a modest, two-bedroom rental in the Keddie Resort area. The walls were thin, the furniture was dated, the heating barely worked during the cold mountain winters. But it was theirs. Sue worked hard to make it feel like home. She decorated with what little she had. She cooked meals in the small kitchen. She read to her youngest boys at night. She tried to give them stability. Her oldest son, John, was tall for his age, with shaggy brown hair and a quiet demeanor. He helped his mother whenever he could, carrying groceries, chopping wood, watching over his younger siblings. Sheila, her oldest daughter, was responsible and mature beyond her years. Tina was sweet and gentle, always smiling. Ricky and Greg were typical young boys, full of energy, laughter, and mischief. Life in Keddie wasn't perfect, until the morning of April 12, 1981. That morning, Sheila Sharp returned home after spending the night at a friend's house next door. She walked up the steps to cabin 28, expecting to find her family still asleep. It was early, just after 7:00 a.m. The sun was beginning to filter through the trees. Birds chirped in the distance. Everything seemed normal. But when Sheila opened the front door, she stepped into a nightmare. Before we go further into what Sheila found that morning, let's take a moment to understand who Sue Sharp really was and why this case is so unbearably tragic. Sue Sharp was not a perfect person, she never claimed to be. But she was a devoted mother. That's what everyone who knew her said. She loved her children fiercely. She would do anything for them. At 36 years old, Sue had already lived a difficult life. Her marriage to James Sharp had been troubled for years. There were arguments. There was tension. There were moments when Sue feared for her safety and the safety of her children. Finally, she made the painful decision to leave. She packed up her 5 kids, said goodbye to everything familiar, and drove across the country to start over. She chose Keddie because it was remote, because it was affordable, because she thought it would be safe. Sue was a small woman, just 5 foot slender, with soft features and kind eyes. She worked whatever jobs she could find to make ends meet. She didn't have much money. She didn't have fancy things, but she made sure her children were fed. She made sure they had clothes. She made sure they knew they were loved. Her son John, 15 years old, was her right hand. He was quiet, introspective, and protective of his younger siblings. He had recently started exploring his independence, spending time with friends, staying out a little later. But he was a good kid. He helped his mom around the house. He looked after Ricky and Greg. He was respectful and hardworking. John had dreams. He wanted to finish high school. He talked about getting a job, maybe learning a trade. He wanted to make his mother proud. Sheila, 14, was the responsible one. She babysat the younger kids when Sue had to work. She helped with homework. She kept the house tidy. She was thoughtful and reliable, the kind of daughter every mother hopes for. Tina, 12 years old, was the gentle soul of the family. She loved animals. She loved drawing. She had a soft voice and a sweet smile. She was the kind of girl who noticed when someone was sad and tried to cheer them up. She loved her mother deeply and often left little notes around the house telling Sue how much she appreciated her. Ricky, 10, and Greg, 5, were the little ones. They were full of energy and curiosity. They loved exploring the woods around Ketty. They built forts out of branches. They caught frogs in the creek. They were innocent, carefree boys who believed the world was good. This was Sue Sharp's world, a small cabin in the mountains, 5 children, a fresh start, hope. And on the night of April 11, 1981, all of that was destroyed. In the weeks leading up to that terrible night, there were small signs that something wasn't quite right in Ketty. Sue had mentioned to a few neighbors that she felt uneasy. She couldn't quite explain it, just a feeling. She said she sometimes heard noises outside the cabin late at night, footsteps, rustling in the bushes. She thought maybe it was animals, or maybe just her imagination. But it wasn't just Sue who felt uncomfortable. Sheila later told investigators that in as before the murders, she noticed a man hanging around cabin 28. He didn't live in the area. She didn't recognize him. He was older, maybe in his 30s or 40s, with dark hair and a rough appearance. He would stand near the trees watching. When Sheila looked at him, he didn't look away. He just stared. She mentioned it to her mother. Sue brushed it off. She told Sheila it was probably just someone passing through. Ketty was a small community, but it was also a resort area. People came and went. Strangers weren't unusual. But Sheila couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On the evening of April 11, Sue decided to let the kids have a normal Saturday night. Sheila asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house, cabin 27, right next door. Sue said yes. John had a friend over as well, a boy named Dana Wingate, 17, who lived nearby. Dana was a good kid, polite, friendly. He and John often hung out together. Tina, Ricky, and Greg stayed home with their mother. Sue made dinner. The kids watched TV. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Around 10:00 p.m., Sue sent Ricky and Greg to bed in the bedroom they shared. Tina stayed up a little longer, talking with her mom and John and Dana in the living room. Eventually, Tina went to bed too, climbing into the top bunk in the boys' room. Sue, John, and Dana stayed up talking. The cabin was quiet. The night was still. And then sometime after midnight, someone came to the door. What happened next is difficult to describe. It's difficult to imagine. But it's important to understand the horror of what took place in cabin 28 that night, because only by understanding the brutality can we truly grasp the evil that walked through that door. Investigators believe that sometime between 12:30 am and 1:00 am, there was a knock at the door. Sue Sharp may have recognized the person. She may have let them in willingly. Or perhaps the door was forced open. We don't know for certain. But what we do know is this: multiple intruders entered cabin 28. They brought weapons, a hammer, knives, kitchen utensils taken from Sue's own home. And they brought rage. Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate were all in the living room when the attack began. The assault was sudden, violent, overwhelming. Sue was struck first, blow after blow to the head with a hammer. The sound must have been sickening. The dull thud of metal against bone. She tried to fight back. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She tried to protect herself. She tried to scream. But the attackers didn't stop. John, just 15 years old, lunged toward his mother. He tried to defend her. He was a strong kid, tall and athletic. But he was no match for grown men with weapons. He was beaten. His skull was fractured. He fought as hard as he could, but there were too many of them. The attack was too vicious. Dana Wingate, 17, also tried to fight. He was struck repeatedly with the hammer. He was stabbed. His body showed signs of a desperate struggle: cuts, bruises, defensive wounds. He didn't run. He didn't abandon his friend. He fought until he couldn't fight anymore. The living room became a scene of unimaginable carnage. Blood splattered across the walls. Furniture was overturned. The carpet was soaked red. And in the back bedroom, just feet away, Ricky, Greg, and Tina were still asleep. Or at least they appeared to be. Ricky, 10 years old, and Greg, 5, were in the bottom bunk. Tina was in the top bunk. Somehow, miraculously, impossibly, they were not attacked. Investigators later theorized that the killers may have checked on the children and assumed they were too young to be a threat, or perhaps the killers knew the children and didn't want to harm them. Or perhaps in the chaos and darkness, the killer simply didn't see them. But Tina was taken. At some point during or after the murders, one of the attackers went into the bedroom and took Tina from her bed. She was wearing her nightgown. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She may have been in shock. She may have been threatened into silence. Tina was led out of cabin 28 and into the night. She was never seen alive again. When Sheila Sharp woke up the next morning in cabin 27, she had no idea what had happened just a few feet away. She said goodbye to her friend and walked back to cabin 28. It was just after 7:00 a.m. The morning was cold and quiet. The resort was still asleep. Sheila walked up to the front door. She turned the handle. The door was unlocked. She stepped inside, and she saw them, her mother, her brother, Dana. All three of them were dead, lying in the living room in pools of blood. Sheila didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. Then, she turned and ran to cabin 27. She pounded on the door. When her friend's mother answered, Sheila could barely speak. She gasped. "Something's really wrong." The woman followed Sheila back to cabin 28. She looked inside. She saw the bodies, and she immediately called the police. Within minutes, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office was notified. Deputies rushed to the scene. When they arrived and entered cabin 28, even seasoned law enforcement officers were shaken by what they found. Sue Sharp was lying on her side near the kitchen. Her face was battered beyond recognition. She had been struck with such force that her skull was fractured in multiple places. She had also been stabbed. There was a knife still lodged in her body. John Sharp was on the floor near the couch. His head had been caved in. There were stab wounds across his chest and back. He had fought hard. There was blood under his fingernails, skin cells, signs of a struggle. Dana Wingate was slumped against the wall. He, too, had been beaten and stabbed. His injuries were so severe that it was clear the attack had been prolonged and brutal. But that wasn't the worst of it. When deputies checked the back bedroom, they found Ricky and Greg alive. The two boys were still in their bunk bed, covered in blankets, seemingly unharmed. They had slept through the entire massacre. At least, that's what it appeared. Later, investigators would question how two young boys could have slept through such a violent, loud, and chaotic attack happening just feet away. Some theorized that the boys had been awake, that they had heard everything, but were too terrified to move. Others believed they may have been drugged or threatened into silence. But in that moment, the priority was getting them out of the cabin and to safety. Sheila, Ricky, and Greg were taken to a neighbor's house. Sheila was in shock. Ricky and Greg were confused, asking for their mother. And then, someone asked the question that would haunt investigators for years. Where's Tina? The Plumas County Sheriff's Office immediately launched a full-scale investigation. The brutality of the crime was unlike anything the small department had ever seen. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. This was rage. Detectives cordoned off cabin 28 and began processing the scene. What they found painted a picture of absolute horror. The living room was drenched in blood. The walls were splattered. The furniture was overturned. A hammer, believed to be the primary weapon, was found near one of the bodies. It was covered in blood and hair. Knives from Sue's own kitchen had been used in the attack. There were no signs of forced entry. The front door had been unlocked when Sheila found it. This suggested that Sue had either opened the door willingly, or that the attackers had a key. But here's where things got strange. In the back bedroom where Ricky and Greg had been sleeping, investigators found something odd. The blankets covering the boys had been carefully arranged, almost tucked in, as if someone had checked on them, as if someone had made sure they were covered and safe. Why would killers who had just brutally murdered 3 people take to tuck in 2 sleeping children? And then there was Tina. Tina's bed was empty. Her nightgown was gone. There was no sign of a struggle in the bedroom, no blood, no evidence of violence. She had simply vanished. Investigators immediately began searching the surrounding woods. They brought in search dogs. They scoured the area for miles. They checked abandoned cabins, old mine shafts, the nearby creek. Nothing. Tina Sharp had disappeared without a trace. As the investigation continued, forensic teams worked to gather every piece of evidence they could from cabin 28. Blood samples were collected from the scene. DNA testing wasn't as advanced in 1981 as it is today, but investigators were able to determine blood types. They found blood from Sue, John, and Dana, but they also found blood that didn't match any of the victims. This was critical. It meant the killers had been injured in the attack. It meant they had left behind evidence. Fingerprints were lifted from various surfaces, doorknobs, furniture, the murder weapons. Some prints matched the victims, others were unidentified. Investigators also found a bloody footprint near the front door. It was large, likely belonging to a man. It didn't match any of the victims' shoes. Hair and fibers were collected as well. Some were consistent with the victims. Others were not. The evidence was there. The killers had left traces of themselves all over cabin 28. But without a suspect, the evidence was useless. Detectives began interviewing neighbors, friends, and anyone who had been in the Keddie area on the night of April 11. One of the first people they spoke to was Sheila. She was still in shock, but she did her best to answer their questions. Sheila told them about the man she had seen hanging around the cabin in the days before the murders. She described him as older, with dark hair, rough-looking. She said he had made her uncomfortable. But she didn't know his name. She had never seen him before. Detectives also interviewed Ricky and Greg. The boys were young, too young to fully understand what had happened, but they were able to provide some information. Ricky, 10 years old, told investigators that he remembered hearing noises that night. Loud noises, voices. But he had been too scared to get out of bed. He said he had pulled the covers over his head and tried to go back to sleep. Greg, only 5, didn't remember much. He said he had been asleep, but both boys confirmed that Tina had been in the top bunk when they went to bed, and when they woke up, she was gone. Detectives worked tirelessly to establish a timeline of events. They needed to understand exactly what had happened that night, minute by minute, hour by hour. They knew that Sheila had left in 28 around 80 p. to sleep at her friend's house next door in cabin 27. She had said goodnight to her mother, her brothers, and Dana Wingate before leaving. John and Dana had stayed up with Sue, talking and watching television. At some point around 1:00 p.m., Sue had sent Ricky and Greg to bed. Tina had followed shortly after. So the question became, when did the attack occur? Investigators interviewed neighbors in the surrounding cabins. Several people reported hearing unusual sounds that night, but the testimonies were maddeningly inconsistent. One neighbor, living in cabin 26, reported hearing what sounded like muffled screaming around 1:00 a.m. She said it sounded like a woman's voice, followed by what might have been a man's voice shouting. But the sounds were distant, distorted by the wind in the trees. She had assumed it was just people arguing. She had rolled over and gone back to sleep. Another neighbor reported hearing a loud bang, like furniture being overturned, sometime after midnight. But again, the neighbor hadn't thought much of it. Sounds carried strangely in the mountains. It could have been anything. A third neighbor claimed to have heard a strange, guttural sound, like someone gasping for air or choking, around 1:30. But this neighbor had been drinking that night and wasn't certain of the time, or even if the sound had been real. What was clear was this: people had heard something. Multiple people had heard disturbances, but no one had called the police. No one had gone to investigate. And so Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dinah Wingate had died alone, just feet away from neighbors who might have been able to help. While forensic teams processed cabin 28 and detectives interviewed witnesses, another team focused entirely on finding Tina Sharp. 12-year-old Tina had vanished without a trace. There was no blood in her bedroom, no signs of a struggle, no indication of where she had been taken or why. Search and rescue teams combed through the dense forest surrounding Keddie. They checked every cabin, every trail, every abandoned structure within a 10-mile radius. Volunteers from the community joined the effort. Flyers with Tina's photo were distributed across California and neighboring states. The search went on for days, then weeks, but there was no sign of Tina. Investigators considered several theories. Theory 1: Tina had been taken by the killers as a hostage. Perhaps they intended to use her as leverage or insurance. Perhaps they planned to release her once they felt safe. Theory 2: Tina had been taken because she had seen the killers' faces. She was a witness. She had to be eliminated, but not in the cabin. Perhaps the killers had taken her somewhere else to avoid leaving more evidence at the scene. Theory 3: Tina had been taken for reasons that had nothing to do with the murders. Perhaps she had been targeted specifically. Perhaps someone had wanted her. All three theories were disturbing. But without Tina's body, investigators couldn't rule any of them out. Days turned into months. Tina Sharp remained missing, and the case began to grow cold. As the investigation progressed, detectives began to focus on potential suspects. The brutality of the crime suggested that the killers had known the victims. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was personal. But who would want to kill Sue Sharp and her children? Investigators started by looking at the most obvious suspect, Sue's estranged husband, James Sharp. James, known as Jim, had not taken the separation well. According to friends and family, he had been angry when Sue moved the children to California. He had made threats. He had told people that Sue would regret leaving him. Detectives traveled to Connecticut to question Jim Sharp. They asked him where he had been on the night of April 11, 1981. Jim had an alibi. He had been at home in Connecticut, over 500 miles away from Keddy. He had been with friends. He had witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts. But investigators didn't let him off the hook that easily. Could Jim have hired someone to kill Sue? Could he have orchestrated the attack from across the country? They dug deeper. They examined Jim's finances. They interviewed his friends. They looked for any connection between Jim and anyone in California who might have carried out the murders on his behalf. They found nothing. Jim Sharp was eventually ruled out as a suspect. So if it wasn't Jim, who was it? As investigators continued to interview neighbors and residents of the Keddy Resort, one name kept coming up: Martin Smarty. Martin Smart, known as Marty, lived in cabin 26 just next door to cabin 28. He was a short, stocky man in his late 30s with a rough demeanor and a known temper. He had moved to Keddy with his wife, Marilyn, and their 2 children a few months before the murders. But by April 1981, the marriage was falling apart. Marilyn had recently left Marty and moved out of cabin 26, taking the children with her. Marty was living alone, angry, bitter, and drinking heavily. And according to several neighbors, Marty Smart had developed an unhealthy obsession with Sue Sharp. Witnesses reported that Marty had frequently visited cabin 28. He would stop by unannounced, offering to help Sue with chore repairs around the cabin. At first, Sue had been polite and grateful. But over time, Marty's visits became more frequent and more uncomfortable. Sue had confided in a friend that Marty made her uneasy. She said he would stare at her. He would stand too close. He would make comments that felt inappropriate. And after Marilyn left him, Marty's behavior became even more erratic. Neighbors reported seeing Marty standing outside cabin 28 late at night, just watching. One neighbor claimed to have seen Marty peering through the windows. Sheila Sharp told investigators that she had seen Marty hanging around the cabin on multiple occasions in the days before the murders. She said he made her uncomfortable. She had mentioned it to her mother. But here's what made Marty Smart a prime suspect: his behavior on the morning of April 12. On the morning the bodies were discovered, several neighbors noticed that Marty Smart was acting strangely. First, he had been up unusually early. Marty was known to sleep in, especially when he had been drinking the night before. But on the morning of April 12, he was outside his cabin before 7:00 a.m., pacing, smoking cigarettes, looking agitated. When police arrived at cabin 20, Marty immediately approached them. He asked what was going on. He seemed overly interested in the details. He kept asking questions that, in hindsight, seemed oddly specific. Who's, he asked. How many bodies? Where's the little girl? One deputy later reported that Marty had asked about Tina before anyone had publicly mentioned that she was missing. How did Marty know Tina was gone? When questioned, Marty claimed he had overheard someone talking about it. But the deputy wasn't convinced. Detectives interviewed Marty multiple times in the days following the murders. They asked him where he had been on the night of April 11. Marty said he had been home alone in cabin 26. He said he had been drinking. He said he had gone to bed around 100 p.m. and hadn't heard anything unusual. But his story didn't add up. Several neighbors had reported seeing lights on in cabin 46 well past midnight. One neighbor claimed to have heard voices coming from Marty's cabin around 1:00 a.m., the same time the murders were believed to have occurred. And then there was the physical evidence. When detectives searched cabin 26, they found several items of interest. A bloody knife in the kitchen. Marty claimed he had cut himself while cooking a few days earlier. A hammer in the garage. Marty said it was his, he used it for repairs. Bloodstains on a pair of Marty's boots. Again, Marty claimed the blood was his from a cut on his hand. But here's the problem. The blood on the boots was tested. It didn't match Marty's blood type. In fact, it matched one of the victims. When confronted with this evidence, Marty became defensive. He claimed the police were framing him. He said he had no reason to hurt Sue or her family. He said he barely knew them. But the evidence and the witness statements suggested otherwise. As investigators dug deeper into Marty Smart's life, they discovered something troubling. Marty had a friend, a man named John Babbitt. Bo was staying with Marty in cabin 26 around the time of the murders. He was a drifter, a man with a violent criminal past. Bo had served time in prison for assault. He was known to be aggressive, unpredictable, and dangerous. And according to several witnesses, Bo had also been obsessed with Sue Sharp. Neighbors reported seeing Bo watching cabin 28 from Marty's porch. One witness claimed to have seen Bo standing in the woods behind cabin 28 on more than one occasion, just staring at the windows. Another witness, a teenage girl who lived in the resort, later came forward with a disturbing story. She said that a few weeks before the murders, Bo Babbitt had approached her and asked her inappropriate questions about Sue Sharp. He had asked if Sue had a boyfriend. He had asked if Sue was lonely. He had asked if the girl thought Sue would be interested in older men. The girl had felt so uncomfortable that she had avoided Bo after that encounter. Now, investigators wanted to know where was Bo the night of April 11. When questioned, Bo gave the same story as Marty. He said he had been in cabin 26 all night. He said he had been drinking with Marty. He said they had both gone to early and hadn't heard anything. But once again, the story didn't match the evidence. Witnesses reported seeing Bo outside cabin 26 late that night, well after the time he claimed to have gone to bed. One neighbor said she saw Bo walking toward the woods behind cabin 28 around midnight. And then there was the physical evidence linking Bo to the crime scene. Investigators found a strand of hair on one of the victims' bodies. The hair was dark, coarse, and didn't match any of the victims. When compared to a sample from Bo Babbitt, the hair was consistent with his. Additionally, a fingerprint found on the railing inside cabin 28 was a partial match to Bo's prints. Bo was brought in for further questioning, but he lawyered up almost immediately. He refused to answer any more questions. He refused to take a polygraph test. And just a few weeks later, Bo Babbitt left Keddy. He moved out of cabin 26 and disappeared. For years, investigators tried to track him down, but Bo was skilled at staying off the grid. He moved frequently, used aliases, and avoided law enforcement. By the time detectives finally located him years later, the trail had gone cold. In the months following the murders, the Plumas County Sheriff's received dozens of tips. Most were dead ends. Some were well-meaning but unhelpful. A few were outright hoaxes. But one tip stood out. Approximately 6 months after the murders, an anonymous letter arrived at the sheriff's office. It was handwritten, brief, and chilling. The letter read, "I know who killed the Sharps. It was Marty and Bo. They were drunk and angry. Sue rejected, handle it. Tina saw everything. They took her. You won't find her alive." The letter was unsigned. There was no return address. The handwriting couldn't be traced. Investigators tried to determine who had sent the letter. They analyzed the handwriting. They tested the paper and envelope for fingerprints. They looked for any clue that might reveal the sender's identity. But the letter remained a mystery. Still, the content of the letter aligned with the investigators' suspicions. Marty Smart and Bo Babbitt had motive. They had opportunity. They had been acting suspiciously. The evidence pointed toward them. But without a confession, without Tina's body, there wasn't enough to arrest them. The case stalled. Months turned into years. and the Ketty cabin murders became one of California's most infamous unsolved cases. For 3 years, Tina Sharp's fate remained unknown. Her family held out hope that she was still alive, that maybe she had been taken by someone who hadn't killed her, that maybe she had run away, that maybe one day she would come home. But deep down it was gone. On April 25, 1984, almost exactly 3 years after the murders, a group of people were camping in a remote area near Feather Falls, about 60 miles from Ketty. They were setting up their campsite when one of them noticed something strange partially buried in the dirt near a fallen tree. It was a skull. At first, they thought it might be an animal. But as they looked closer, they realized it was human. They immediately contacted authorities. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found more than just a skull. Scattered in the area were additional bones, fragments of clothing, and personal items. The remains were carefully collected and transported to a forensic lab for analysis. Dental records confirmed what everyone had feared. The remains belonged to Tina Sharp. She had been 12 years old when she was taken from cabin 28. She had been wearing her nightgown. She had been terrified. And now 3 years later, her family finally had an answer. Tina was dead. The discovery of Tina's remains opened a new chapter in the investigation. But it also raised more questions than it answered. Forensic pathologists examined the bones carefully. Due to the length of time the remains had been exposed to the elements, 3 years, much of the soft tissue was gone. This made it extremely difficult to determine a precise cause of death. However, investigators were able to determine a few critical facts. First, Tina's skull showed signs of trauma. There were fractures consistent with blunt force impact, similar to the injuries sustained by Sue, John, and Dana. This suggested that Tina had been killed in a manner consistent with the other victims. Second, the location where Tina's remains were found was significant. Feather Falls was approximately 60 miles from Ketty, a remote, heavily forested area that was difficult to access. Whoever had taken Tina there had known the area well. It wasn't a random dumping ground. It was deliberate. Third, some of Tina's personal items were found with the remains, including pieces of her nightgown. This confirmed that she had been taken directly from cabin 28 and had not been allowed to change or prepare in any way. But here's what troubled investigators: most Tina's remains were scattered. Some bones were missing entirely. This suggested that animals had disturbed the site over the years, but it also raised the possibility that Tina's body had been deliberately dismembered or moved. The forensic team couldn't say for certain. What they could say was this: Tina had been murdered, and whoever killed her had gone to great lengths to hide her body in a remote location far from Ketty. With the discovery of Tina's remains, the Ketty cabin murders investigation was officially reopened. Detectives returned to their suspect list. Marty Smart and Boba Bede were still at the top, but by 1984 both men had left the area. Marty had moved to another part of California. Bo had vanished entirely, moving from state to state, living under different names. Avoiding contact with law enforcement, investigators tried to build a case. They reviewed the evidence from cabin 28. They re-interviewed witnesses. They looked for any new leads. And then, in 1988, they got a break. Marilyn Smart, Marty's ex-wife, came forward with new information. Marilyn had divorced Marty years earlier and had tried to put the nightmare of Ketty behind her. But the guilt had been eating at her. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She told investigators that on the night of the murders, Marty had come home to cabin 26 in the early hours of the morning. Around 20 a.m., he had been covered in blood. Marilyn said she had been staying at cabin 26 that night, trying to work things out with Marty. When he came home, she asked him what had happened. Where had he been? Why was he covered in blood? Marty had told her to keep her mouth shut. He said if she told anyone, he would kill her too. Marilyn had been terrified. She had packed up her things and left Ketty the next day, taking her children with her. She had never reported what she saw. But now, years later, she was ready to tell the truth. Marty's confession. Marilyn's testimony was explosive. But it wasn't enough to arrest Marty. The evidence was circumstantial. Marty's blood-soaked appearance could explain away. He could claim he had been in a fight, or that he had injured himself. Investigators needed more. They decided to approach Marty directly. They brought him in for questioning in 1988. Marty was older now. He looked worn down. He had been drinking heavily for years. His health was failing. Detectives sat him down and laid out the evidence. They told him about the blood on his boots. They told him about the witnesses who had seen him near cabin 28. They told him about Marilyn's statement. And then they asked him point blank, "Did you kill Sue Sharp and her family?" Marty was quiet for a long time. Then he said something strange. "I didn't mean for it to happen the way it did." The detectives leaned forward. Was this a confession? But before they could press further, Marty stopped talking. He demanded a lawyer. The interview was over. Marty Smart never spoke about the case again. Despite Marty's cryptic statement, "I didn't mean for it to happen the way it did." Prosecutors determined they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with murder. Yes, there were witness statements. Yes, there was blood evidence. Yes, there was suspicious behavior. But there was no murder weapon definitively linked to Marty. There were no fingerprints that conclused him inside cabin 28 at the time of the murders. There was no DNA evidence. DNA technology was still in its infancy in the late 1980s. And most importantly, there was no body of evidence strong enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. So Marty Smart walked free. Bo Bubede remained in the wind. And the case went cold once again. In the years following the murders, Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp were all laid to rest. Sue had dreamed of giving her children a better life. She had moved across the country to escape violence and find peace. Instead, she found horror. John had been a protective older brother, a hard-working young man with his whole life ahead of him. He had died trying to defend his mother. Dana had been a loyal friend. He could have run. But he stayed. He fought. He died a hero. And Tina, sweet, gentle Tina, had been taken from her bed in the middle of the night. She had been 12 years old. She had loved drawing. She had loved animals. She had left little notes for her mother telling her how much she loved her. Tina had spent 3 years alone in the wilderness, her remains scattered and forgotten until someone finally found her. Sheila, Ricky, and Greg were left to pick up the pieces. They had survived the night of 1981. But they would carry the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. Sheila, who had opened the door to cabin 28 that morning and found her family slaughtered. Ricky, who had heard the sounds of his mother and brother being murdered just feet away and had been too terrified to move. Greg, who had been only 5 years old, too young to understand, but old enough to remember. The 3 surviving Sharp children were separated and sent to live with different relatives. They grew up haunted by the question that would never be answered: why? Why had this happened to their family? Why had their mother, brother, and sister been taken from them? Why had the killers been allowed to walk free? The years passed slowly for those still seeking justice for the Sharp family. Throughout the 1990s, the Ketty Cabin murders remained unsolved. The case files sat in boxes at the Plumas County Sheriff's Office gathering dust. Detectives had moved on to other cases. The public's attention had shifted to newer crimes, fresher tragedies. But the families never forgot. Sheila Sharp, now an adult, never stopped searching for answers. She gave interviews to local newspapers. She contacted television shows that featured unsolved crimes. She kept her family's story alive, hoping that someone somewhere would come forward with the information needed to finally bring the killers to justice. And then, in 2000, one of the primary suspects died. Marty Smart passed away from cancer. He was in his mid-50s. He had spent the last years of his life moving from place to place, drinking heavily, and deteriorating both physically and mentally. Some people who knew Marty in his final years said he was haunted. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. He would mumble about the cabin and the blood. He would talk about seeing faces in his dreams, faces that wouldn't leave him alone. But Marty never confessed. He took whatever he knew about the night of April 11, 1981, to his grave. With Marty's death, many people assumed the case would never be solved. If Marty had been involved, and most investigators believed he was, his death meant that one avenue to the truth had been permanently closed. But the story was far from over. While Marty Smart died in 2000, Bo Bubede lived on for several more years. Bo had spent decades moving from state to state, living under various aliases and avoiding any connection to the Ketty case. He worked odd jobs, construction, manual labor, anything that paid cash and didn't require background checks. People who encountered Bo during those years described him as paranoid. He didn't trust anyone. He rarely stayed in one place for more than a few months. He would become agitated if anyone asked him personal questions about his past. In the early 2000s, investigators attempted to track Bo down once more. They wanted to question him again, to see if age and time had loosened his tongue. They wanted to confront him with the evidence that had grown stronger over the years as forensic technology advanced. But by the time they located him, Bo was dying. He had developed serious health problems, likely related to years of heavy drinking and drug use. He was living in a rundown trailer in the Midwest, isolated and alone. Detectives flew out to speak with him. They arrived at his trailer and knocked on the door. Bo answered. He was thin, frail, and looked far older than his years. His eyes were sunken, his hands shook. The detectives identified themselves. They told Bo they wanted to ask him some questions about Ketty. Bo stared at them for a long moment. Then he said, "I've got nothing to say to you," and he shut the door. The detectives tried again. They knocked. They called out to him. They explained that they just wanted to talk, that they weren't there to arrest him, just to hear his side of the story. But Bo never opened the door again. A few months later, Bo Bubid died. Like Marty, he never confessed, he never provided answers. He never gave the Sharp family the closure they so desperately needed. With both primary suspects dead, it seemed the Ketty cabin murders would remain unsolved forever. But in 2013, something unexpected happened. In 2013, more than 30 years after the murders, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office made an announcement that shocked the community. They were reopening the Ketty cabin murders investigation. A new sheriff had taken office, Sheriff Greg Hagwood. Unlike his predecessors, Hagwood was determined to solve the case. He believed the answers were buried somewhere in the evidence that had been collected over the years. He believed that modern forensic technology could provide the breakthrough investigators needed. Hagwood assembled a team of detectives and forensic specialists. They pulled the old case files from storage. They reviewed every witness statement, every piece of evidence, every photograph from the crime scene. And they discovered something that had been missed or ignored for decades. In one of the evidence boxes, tucked away and nearly forgotten, was a piece of paper. It was a handwritten letter and had been found in cabin 26, Marty Smart's cabin, during a search conducted shortly after the murders. The letter had been cataloged as evidence in 1981, but for reasons that remain unclear, it had never been thoroughly analyzed or pursued. Now, in 2013, investigators took a closer look. The letter appeared to be written by Marty Smart. The handwriting matched samples of Marty's writing, and the content of the letter was deeply disturbing. The letter was addressed to Marilyn, Marty's ex-wife. It was rambling, disjointed, and filled with rage. In the letter, Marty expressed anger at Sue Sharp. He accused Sue of rejecting him, of humiliating him, of making him feel worthless. And then, buried in the middle of the letter, was a line that made investigators' blood run cold. "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." 4 people: Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, Tina Sharp. This was as close to a confession as investigators had ever seen. But why had this letter been ignored for so long? As Sheriff Hagwood's team dug deeper into the case files, they began to uncover evidence of something even more sinister than the murders themselves. They began to suspect that there had been a cover-up. In the early 1980s, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office had been a small department with limited resources. The Ketty case was the biggest thing they'd ever handled. And according to some former employees, there had been pressure, both internal and external, to close the case quickly. But why? Investigators in 2013 discovered that Marty Smart had connections to local law enforcement. Specifically, Marty had a close relationship with a deputy sheriff who had been one of the first responders to Cabin 28 on the morning of April 12, 1981. This deputy, whose name has been redacted in some public records but was known to investigators, had reportedly been friends with Marty. They had been seen drinking together at local bars. They had socialized, and according to some witnesses, This deputy had been seen at cabin 26 on the night of the murders. Was it possible that this deputy had helped Marty cover up the crime? Was it possible that evidence had been intentionally mishandled, ignored, or destroyed to protect Marty? Sheriff Hagwood's team found several red flags that suggested this might be the case. First, the crime scene at cabin 28 had been poorly secured. Photographs from the day of the discovery show multiple people walking through the cabin: neighbors, onlookers, even journalists. Critical evidence could have been contaminated or lost. Second, several pieces of evidence had gone missing over the years. The hammer believed to be the murder weapon had been logged into evidence, but it had later disappeared from the evidence locker. Similarly, a bloody knife that had been collected from the scene had vanished. Third, witness statements had been mishandled. Some witnesses who had reported seeing Marty Smart near cabin 28 on the night of the murders claimed that their statements had been ignored or dismissed by investigators. And fourth, most damningly, the letter from Marty's cabin, the one that appeared to be a confession, had been buried in the evidence files and never pursued. Was this incompetence? Or was it intentional? Sheriff Hagwood couldn't say for certain. Many of the original investigators had since retired or died. The deputy who had been friends with Marty had passed away years earlier. But the more Hagwood's team investigated, the more convinced they became that something had gone terribly wrong with the original investigation. With the case officially reopened, Sheriff Hagwood's team turned to modern forensic technology to analyze the evidence that still existed. DNA testing had advanced significantly since 1981. Techniques that didn't exist 30 years ago could now extract usable DNA from even the smallest samples. Investigators sent several pieces of evidence to a forensic lab for analysis. Blood samples that had been collected from cabin 28 were retested. The results confirmed what investigators had suspected. There was blood at the scene that didn't belong to any of the victims. The unidentified blood was consistent with two different individuals, likely the killers. But here's where things got complicated. Marty Smart and Bo Babid were both dead. Investigators couldn't collect DNA samples from them directly. However, they were able to obtain DNA samples from Marty's and Bo's living relatives. The lab compared the unidentified blood from cabin 28 to the DNA samples from the relatives. The results were inconclusive. The samples from the crime scene were degraded after more than 30 years. The lab could determine that the unidentified blood was consistent with individuals who could be related to Marty and Bo. But they couldn't say definitively that the blood belonged to them. It was frustrating. The evidence was there. It pointed to Marty and Bo. But it wasn't enough to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Still, investigators pressed on. They re-examined the fingerprints that had been lifted from cabin 28. They used modern fingerprint analysis software to compare the prints to those of Marty and Bo again. The results were suggestive but not conclusive. Some of the prints were partial matches, but not strong enough to hold up in court. And then, investigators turned their attention to Tina's remains. In 2016, investigators decided to take another look at the evidence from the site where Tina's remains had been found in 1984. The original forensic analysis had been limited by the technology of the time. But now, with advancements in forensic pathology and DNA analysis, investigators hoped they might be able to learn more about what had happened to Tina. Tina's remains had been kept in storage at the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. They were carefully transported to a state-of-the-art forensic lab. Pathologists re-examined the bones. They used new imaging techniques to analyze the fractures on Tina's skull. They determined that the injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, similar to the injuries sustained by Sue John and Dana. This suggested that Tina had been killed shortly after being taken from cabin 28. She likely hadn't been held captive for days or weeks. She had been murdered the same night as the others, and then her body had been transported to Feather Falls. But why take her body so far from the crime scene? Investigators theorized that the killers had taken Tina because she was a witness. She had seen their faces, she could identify them, so they had removed her from the cabin, perhaps intending to kill her somewhere else to avoid leaving more evidence at cabin 28. After killing Tina, the killers had driven her body to Feather Falls, a remote, heavily forested area where they believed it would never be found. It had taken 3 years for someone to stumble upon her remains. By then, much of the evidence had been lost to the elements. But there was one more piece of evidence that investigators wanted to examine: Tina's nightgown. Fragments of the nightgown had been found with Tina's remains. In 2016, investigators sent those fragments to the lab for DNA testing. The results were stunning. The lab found DNA on the nightgown that didn't belong to Tina. It was male DNA, and when compared to the DNA samples from Marty Smart's and Bo Babbitt's relatives, the results showed a familial match. The DNA on Tina's nightgown was consistent with someone related to either Marty or Bo. This was the strongest evidence yet linking the suspects to the crime. In 2016, Sheriff Hagwood held a press conference to announce the findings of the reinvestigation. He stood before a room full of journalists, family members, and community members. Behind him were photographs of Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. Hagwood spoke carefully. He explained that while the investigation had made significant progress, the case was not yet closed. He confirmed that Marty Smart and Bo Babbitt were the primary suspects. He explained that new forensic evidence had linked them to the crime scene and to Tina's remains. But he also acknowledged the painful truth: both suspects were dead. "We cannot bring Marty Smart or Bo Babbitt to trial," Hagwood said. "But we can give the Sharp family answers. We can tell them who killed their loved ones. And we can make sure the world knows the truth." Hagwood also addressed the possibility of a cover-up. He said that while his team had found evidence suggesting the original investigation had been mishandled, they could not prove intentional wrongdoing. "What we can say," Hagwood continued, "is that this case should have been solved decades ago. The evidence was there, the suspects were identified, but for reasons we may never fully understand, justice was not served." The press conference was emotional. Family members of the victims were in attendance. Sheila Sharp, now in her 40s, stood and thanked Sheriff Hagwood and his team for their dedication. "For 35 years," Sheila said, her voice shaking, "I've lived with the image of walking into that cabin and seeing my mother and brother on the floor. I've lived with the guilt of wondering if I could have done something to save them. I've lived with the anger of knowing the people who did this were never held accountable." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "But today I finally have answers. Today I can finally say that I know who killed my family. And even though Marty and Bo are gone, even though they'll never face a jury, I can finally start to heal." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. While Sheriff Hagwood's announcement brought some closure to the case, it also raised new questions. If Marty Smart and Bo Babbitt were the primary killers, had they acted alone? The crime scene suggested at least 2 attackers, possibly more. The level of violence, the coordination required to subdue 3 adult victims simultaneously, and the logistics of removing Tina from the cabin all pointed to multiple perpetrators. Some investigators believed there had been a third person involved. Who could it have been? One theory pointed to a man named Jay, a local resident who had been seen with Marty and Bo on several occasions in the weeks leading up to the murders. Jay had a violent criminal history. He had been questioned briefly in 1981 but had provided an alibi and was never seriously pursued as a suspect. In the years following the 2016 announcement, some amateur sleuths and investigative journalists dug into Jay's background. They found disturbing connections. Jay had lived in Arcady in 1981. He had known Marty and Bo. He had been seen at local bars with them. And according to one witness, Jay had made inappropriate comments about Sue Sharp. But there was no physical evidence linking Jay to the crime scene. No DNA. No fingerprints. No witness who could place him at cabin 28 on the night of the murders. Jay denied any involvement. He claimed he'd been nowhere near Arcady on April 11, 1981. Without concrete evidence, investigators couldn't pursue him further. But the theory persisted: Marty and Bo hadn't acted alone. One of the most haunting questions about the Kitty Cabin murders is why? Why did this happen? What could possibly drive someone to commit such unspeakable violence against an innocent family? Investigators believe the motive was a combination of obsession, rejection, and rage. Marty Smart had become obsessed with Sue Sharp. He had been separated from his wife. He was lonely, angry, and drinking heavily. He saw Sue as an object of desire. and when she rejected his advances, he couldn't handle it. In Marty's mind, Sue had humiliated him. She had made him feel small, worthless, powerless. And Marty wanted to feel powerful. Bobo Bede was a violent man with a criminal past. He fed off Marty's anger. He encouraged it, and on the night of April 11, 1981, fueled by alcohol and rage, the two men decided to act. They went to cabin 28. They knocked on the door. Sue likely let them in. He was her neighbor. But once inside, something snapped. Maybe Marty confronted Sue. Maybe he made another advance. Maybe Sue rejected him again. Or maybe she said something that sent him into a fury. Whatever the trigger, the violence began. John tried to defend his mother. Dana tried to help, but they were overpowered. And Tina, poor innocent Tina, witnessed it all. She had to be silenced. So they took her. And they made sure she would never tell anyone what she had seen. Forensic psychologists who have studied the Ketty case believe that Marty Smart exhibited signs of narcissistic personality disorder and possible antisocial tendencies. Marty couldn't handle rejection. He felt entitled to Sue's affection. When she refused him, he experienced what psychologists call narcissistic rage, an intense, overwhelming fury that occurs when a narcissist's ego is wounded. This type of rage is not rational, it's not calculated, it's explosive. And in Marty's case, it was deadly. Bobo Bede, on the other hand, was likely a psychopath. His criminal history showed a pattern of violence. He lacked empathy. He was manipulative. He enjoyed exerting power over others. The combination of Marty's rage and Bo's psychopathy created a perfect storm of violence. Together, they were capable of unspeakable evil. While the case may be considered solved by law enforcement, the impact on the survivors continues to this day. Sheila Sharp has spent her entire adult life dealing with the trauma of what she witnessed. She has undergone years of therapy. She has struggled with PTSD, depression, and survivor's guilt. In interviews, Sheila has spoken openly about the difficulty of moving forward. People ask me if I found closure, she said in a 2018 interview. But how do you find closure when the people who killed your family are dead? How do you find justice when there's no trial? Fiction, no apology. She paused. I've learned to live with it, but I'll never be free of it. Ricky and Greg, the two boys who survived the night of back bedroom, have also struggled. Ricky, now in his 50s, has largely stayed out of the public eye. He has said very little about the murders over the years. Friends describe him as quiet and deeply private. Greg, who was only 5 years old at the time, has fewer memories of that night. But the trauma is still there, buried deep. Both men have had to live with the knowledge that they were just feet away from their mother and brother as they were murdered, and they couldn't do anything to stop it. That kind of guilt is unimaginable. The Ketty cabin murders didn't just devastate the Sharp family. It shattered the entire community. Ketty was a small, close-knit resort town. People knew each other. They looked out for each other. They felt safe. After the murders, that sense of safety was gone. Parents became terrified for their children. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Families moved away. Within a few years, the Ketty resort began to decline. Cabins were abandoned. Businesses closed. The once peaceful mountain community became a ghost town. Cabin 28 itself was eventually torn down. The structure was demolished in the early 2000s, but the land remains. Even today, people who visit the site report an eerie feeling, a heaviness in the air, a sense that something terrible happened there, and that the pain has never fully left. While Sheriff Hagwood's 2016 announcement brought significant revelations, the investigation was far from over. In fact, one of the most explosive developments in the case came in 2018, nearly 40 years after the murders. An anonymous caller contacted the Plumas County Sheriff's Office with information that would shake the investigation to its core. The caller, whose identity has never been publicly revealed, claimed to have been in Ketty on the night of April 11, 1981. The caller said they had witnessed something that night, something they had been too afraid to report for decades. According to the caller, they had seen Marty Smart, Bobo Bede, and a third person near cabin 28 in the early morning hours of April 12, sometime between 2:00 and 20 a.m. The caller described seeing the three men outside cabin 26 acting strangely. One of them was carrying something wrapped in blankets. The caller couldn't see what it was. but the size and shape suggested it could have been a child. The caller watched as the men loaded the bundle into a vehicle and drove away. At the time, the caller hadn't thought much of it. Keddy was a quiet place. People moved around at odd hours. The caller assumed it was just neighbors helping each other with something. But when news of the murders broke the next day, the caller began to suspect they had witnessed something far more sinister. So why hadn't the caller come forward in 1981? Fear. The caller explained that Marty Smart had a reputation for violence. Bo Bubid was known to be dangerous. And the third person involved was someone with connections to local law enforcement. The caller had been terrified of retaliation, so they had stayed silent. But 40 years later, with Marty and Bo both dead, the caller finally felt safe enough to speak. The anonymous tip reignited the investigation. Sheriff Hagwood's team immediately began trying to identify the third person the caller had mentioned. They reviewed the list of people who had been questioned in 1981. They cross-referenced names with individuals who had known Marty and Bo. They looked for anyone with both a connection to the suspects and ties to local law enforcement, and they kept coming back to one name a man will refer to as Deputy M. Deputy M had been a member of the Plumas County Sheriff's Office in 1981. He had been one of the first responders to Cabin 28 on the morning of April 12, and according to multiple witnesses, Deputy M had been friends with Marty Smart. In fact, several people reported seeing Deputy M drinking with Marty and Bo at local bars in the weeks leading up to the murders. But could a law enforcement officer really have been involved in such a brutal crime? Investigators dug deeper into Deputy M's background. They discovered that Deputy M had a troubling history. He had been accused of excessive force on multiple occasions. He had been reprimanded for inappropriate behavior, and he had been known to associate with questionable individuals, including known criminals. More disturbingly, investigators found evidence that Deputy M had been at or near Cabin 26 on the night of the murders. A neighbor reported seeing Deputy M's patrol vehicle parked outside Cabin 26 late on the night of April 11. The neighbor was thawed but assumed Deputy M was just checking in on Marty, who was known to have emotional problems. Another witness, a teenager who had been out walking that night, reported seeing Deputy M outside Cabin 26 around midnight. The witness said Deputy M appeared agitated and told the teenager to go home and mind your own business. And then there was the most damning piece of evidence, a police dispatch log from the night of April 11, 1981. According to the log, Deputy M had radioed in around 11:45 p.m. to report that he was taking a break and would be off duty for approximately 2 hours. This meant Deputy M had no alibi for the time the murders were believed to have occurred. As investigators continued to examine Deputy M's potential involvement, they uncovered more evidence suggesting that the original investigation had been deliberately sabotaged. First, they found that Deputy M had been one of the officers responsible for securing the crime scene at Cabin 28. He had been there within an hour of the bodies being discovered. He had walked through the cabin. He had handled evidence. And according to the crime scene logs, Deputy M had been left alone in 28 for nearly 20 minutes. What had he been doing during that time? Investigators in 2018 believed Deputy M had been destroying evidence. The missing hammer, the primary murder weapon, had last been seen in Deputy M's possession. He had reportedly bagged it as evidence and placed it in his patrol car. But the hammer had never made it to the evidence locker. Deputy M claimed the hammer had been misplaced during the chaos of processing the scene, but investigators now suspected he had deliberately disposed of it to eliminate evidence that might have linked him to the crime. Similarly, the bloody knife that had disappeared from the evidence locker had also been handled by Deputy M. And the letter found in Marty's cabin, the one that appeared to be a confession, had been logged into evidence by Deputy M, but instead of flagging it as critical, he had simply filed it away in a box where it remained hidden for decades. Was this incompetence? Or was Deputy M actively protecting Marty, Bo, and himself? By 2018, Deputy M was in his 70s. He had retired from law enforcement decades earlier and was living in a small town in Northern California. Sheriff Hagwood's team decided it was time to confront him. 2 detectives drove to Deputy M's home. They knocked on the door. An elderly man answered, thin, gray-haired, with a wary expression. The detectives identified themselves and explained that they wanted to ask him some questions about the Ketty cabin murders. Deputy M's expression changed immediately. His face went pale. His hands began to shake. "I have nothing to say about that," he said quietly. The detectives pressed. They told him about the anonymous tip. They told him about the evidence suggesting he had been at cabin 26 on the night of the murders. They told him they knew it mishandled evidence. Deputy M stared at them for a long moment. Then he said something that sent chills down their spines. "You don't understand what it was like back then. You don't understand the pressure. You don't understand what they were capable of." The detectives asked him to clarify. Who was they? What pressure was he talking about? But Deputy M refused to say more. He told the detectives to leave. He said if they wanted to talk to him again, they'd have to go through his lawyer. And that was the end of the conversation. Shortly after the detectives' visit, Deputy M hired a high-profile criminal defense attorney. The attorney released a statement denying that Deputy M had any involvement in the Ketty cabin murders. The statement claimed that Deputy M had been a dedicated law enforcement officer who had done his best under difficult circumstances. It dismissed the allegations of evidence tampering as baseless speculation. The attorney also threatened legal action if the sheriff's office continued to publicly name Deputy M as a suspect. Sheriff Hagwood was faced with a difficult decision. He believed Deputy M had been involved, if not in the murders themselves, then certainly in covering them up. But without a confession or concrete physical evidence, he couldn't prove it. Deputy M had never been charged with any crime related to Ketty. And now, nearly 40 years later, the statute of limitations on many potential charges, such as evidence tampering or obstruction of justice, had expired. Even if investigators could prove Deputy M had destroyed evidence, they couldn't prosecute him for it. It was a bitter pill to swallow. When news broke that a former deputy sheriff might have been involved in the Ketty cabin murders, the community erupted. People who had lived in Ketty in the early 1980s began coming forward with their own stories. Some said they had always suspected, hadn't done enough to solve the case. Others said they had been afraid to speak up at the time, because they didn't trust the police. One former resident gave an interview to a local newspaper, in which she described the atmosphere in Ketty after the murders. "Everyone was scared," she said. "And part of what made it so scary was that we didn't know if we could trust the people who were supposed to protect us. There were rumors, whispers that someone in the sheriff's office was involved, but no one dared say it out loud." Another former resident described seeing Marty Smart and Deputy M together at a bar just days before the murders. He said the two men had been arguing about something, but he couldn't hear what they were saying. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. But looking back, he wondered if they had been planning something. The revelations damaged the reputation of the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Hagwood addressed the controversy in a public statement. "We cannot change the mistakes of the past," he said. "But we can commit to doing better. We can commit to transparency. And we can commit to seeking justice for the Sharp family, no matter how long it takes." The Ketty cabin murders didn't just haunt the survivors and the community. It also took a toll on the investigators who worked on the case. Several detectives who were involved in the original 1981 investigation later said that Ketty was the case that stayed with them. The one they thought about late at night. The one they couldn't let go. One retired detective who had been a young deputy in 1981 gave an interview in 2019 in which he broke down in tears. "I failed them," he said, referring to Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. "We all did. We had the evidence, we had the suspects. But we didn't push hard enough. We didn't fight hard enough. And now they're all gone, and the people who killed them are gone too, and there's no justice. Just emptiness." He paused, wiping his eyes. "I think about Tina a lot. She was just a little girl. She was taken from her bed, and for 3 years she was out there in the woods alone. We should have found her sooner. We should have done more." The emotional weight of the case was evident in every interview, every press conference, every public statement. This wasn't just a case to be solved. It was a tragedy that had scarred everyone it touched. Over the years, the Ketty Cabin murders attracted significant media attention. The case was featured in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and television specials. Some of this media coverage was helpful. It kept the case in the public eye. It generated tips. It put pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating. But some of the media coverage was exploitative. Certain documentaries sensationalized the violence. They focused on the gore, the brutality, the horror, without giving adequate attention to the victims as real people with real lives. Sheila Sharp spoke out against this type of coverage in a 2017 interview. "My mother wasn't just a victim," she said. "She was a person. She had dreams. She loved us. And when people turn her death into entertainment, into something to be consumed and forgotten, it feels like she's being killed all over again." She also expressed frustration with amateur sleuths who had taken an interest in the case. "I appreciate that people want to help," Sheila said. "But some of them cross the line. They harass people. They spread rumors. They make wild accusations without evidence. And it hurts. It hurts my family, and it hurts the investigation." Despite these frustrations, Sheila acknowledged that some media coverage had been beneficial. In particular, she credited the 2016 documentary Cabin 28, which featured interviews with investigators and family members, with bringing renewed attention to the case. "That documentary treated my family with respect," she said. "It focused on who they were, not just how they died, and that's all I've ever wanted." As with any high-profile unsolved case, the Ketty Cabin murders spawned numerous theories and speculation. Some people believed the murders were connected to organized crime. They pointed to rumors that Marty Smart had been involved in drug trafficking and owed money to dangerous people. According to this theory, the murders were a message, a brutal warning to others who might cross the wrong people. But investigators found no evidence to support this theory. There was no indication that Sue or her family had any connection to drugs or organized crime. And the personal nature of the attack, the overkill, the rage, didn't fit the profile of a professional hit. Others believed the murders were part of a satanic ritual. This theory gained traction in the 1980s, during the height of satanic panic that swept across America. Some people claimed to have seen occult symbols near Cabin 28. Others said they had heard rumors of a satanic cult operating in the area. Again, investigators found no credible evidence to support this theory. The crime scene showed no signs of ritualistic activity. The murders were brutal and chaotic, not methodical or symbolic. A third theory suggested that the murders were random, that Marty and Bo had been high on drugs and had simply gone on a violent rampage without any clear motive. But this theory didn't hold up either. The fact that Marty had written about Sue in his letter, the fact that he had been obsessed with her, and the fact that Tina had been specifically targeted all suggested that this was not a random act of violence. The most likely explanation, and the one supported by the evidence, was that the murders were motivated by obsession, rejection, and rage. Marty Smart wanted Sue Sharp. She rejected and he couldn't handle it. It was that simple. And that tragic. One of the most disturbing questions about the Ketty case is whether Marty Smart and Bo Babbitt killed anyone else. Both men had violent tendencies. Both had criminal histories. And both had spent decades moving from place to place, avoiding law enforcement. Is it possible they committed other murders that were never connected to them? Some investigators believe the answer is yes. In the years following Marty's death, detectives began looking into unsolved cases in the areas where Marty had lived. They found several cases that bore similarities to Ketty: brutal attacks on families, victims beaten with blunt objects, evidence of rage and overkill. But none of these cases could be definitively linked to Marty or Bo. The evidence was circumstantial. The timelines didn't always match, and without DNA or fingerprints, there was no way to prove a connection. Bo Babbitt, with his violent criminal history, was an even stronger candidate for additional victims. He had served time for assault. He had a pattern of aggressive behavior, and he had lived in multiple states over the years. Investigators contacted law enforcement agencies in the areas where Bo had lived, asking them to review unsolved homicides from the relevant time periods. Some agencies found cases that warranted a second look, but again, without concrete evidence, no connections could be made. The possibility that Marty and Bo killed others remains an open question, one that may never be answered. For many people who have followed the Ketty case, the story is more than just a crime to be solved. It's a reminder of the fragility of life, the presence of evil in the world, and the importance of justice. Sue Sharp was a woman who was trying to build a better life for her children. She had left an abusive marriage. She had moved across the country. She had started over. And for that, she was murdered. John Sharp was a 15-year-old boy who tried to protect his mother. He could have run. He could have saved himself. But he stayed, he fought. And for that, he was murdered. Dana Wingate was a 17-year-old who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was loyal to his friend. He didn't abandon John or Sue. And for that, he was murdered. Tina Sharp was a 12-year-old girl who loved her mother and her siblings. She was gentle. She was kind. She had her whole life ahead of her. And for the crime of being a witness, she was taken, murdered, and left in the woods. The Ketty Cabin murders are a story of unspeakable evil. But they're also a story of love, courage, and the enduring power of family. In the years since the 2016 announcement, Sheila Sharp has dedicated herself to keeping her family's memory alive. She has given interviews. She has worked with filmmakers and journalists. She has spoken at events about the importance of solving cold cases. But more than that, she has become an advocate for other families who have lost loved ones to violence. "I know what it's like to live with unanswered questions," Sheila said in a 2019 speech. "I know what it's like to feel forgotten by the system. And I want other families to know that they're not alone." Sheila has also worked to raise awareness about the issue of evidence mishandling in cold cases. She has called for reforms to ensure that evidence is properly stored, cataloged, and preserved. "We can't bring my family back," she said, "but we can make sure that other families don't have to go through what we went through." Sheila's advocacy has made a real difference. Several states have passed laws improving the handling of cold case evidence, and the Ketty case has been cited as an example of why these reforms are necessary. In 2020, a memorial was erected in Ketty to honor Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. The memorial is a simple stone marker with the names of the 4 victims and the date of their deaths. It's located near the site where Cabin 28 once stood. The dedication ceremony was attended by family members, friend investigators, and community members. Sheila Sharp spoke at the ceremony. "This memorial is a reminder," she said. "A reminder that my mother, my brother, my sister, and Dana were real people. They loved. They dreamed. And they were taken from us far too soon." She paused, looking at the stone marker. "But they're not forgotten. They never will be." The memorial has become a place of pilgrimage for people who have followed the case. Visitors leave flowers, notes, and tokens of remembrance. Some come to pay their respects. Others come seeking closure of their own. And late at night, when the wind rustles through the pine trees and the moon casts long shadows across the ground, some people say they can feel the presence of those who are lost. Whether that's true or not, one thing is certain: the memory of Sue, John, Dana, and Tina lives on. Even with the breakthroughs of the 2013 reinvestigation and the 2016 announcement identifying Marty Smart and Bo Babbitt as the primary suspects, the Ketty Cabin murders continue to be shrouded in mystery. There are questions that may never be fully answered, details that remain frustratingly unclear, and truths that died with the killers. One of the most persistent questions is, why were Ricky and Greg spared? The 2 young boys were sleeping in the bedroom, just feet away from where their mother were being brutally murdered. The killers entered that bedroom. We know this because they took Tina from her bed. They would have seen Ricky and Greg sleeping in the bottom bunk, yet they left them unharmed. Why? Some investigators believe the killers knew the boys and didn't want to hurt them. This theory suggests that Marty Smart, as a neighbor who had frequently visited Cabin 28, may have felt some twisted sense of affection for the children, or at least didn't see them as threats. Others believe the killers may have checked on the boys and found them genuinely asleep, appearing undisturbed by the violence in the next room. Perhaps the killers decided that if the boys hadn't woken up, they posed no danger as witnesses. A darker theory suggests that the boys were awake, that they heard everything, but were too terrified to move. Perhaps the killers threatened them into silence. Perhaps they told the boys that if they stayed in bed and kept quiet, they would live. Ricky Sharp has never spoken publicly about what he remembers from that night. In the few interviews he's given over the years, he said only that he heard noises, but was too scared to investigate. Greg Sharp, who was only 5 years old at the time, claims to have no clear memories of the night itself, only the chaos and confusion of the following morning. Whether the boys were truly asleep or were frozen in terror, we may never know. Another haunting question is what happened to Tina during those 3 years before her remains were found. The forensic evidence suggests that Tina was killed shortly after being taken from cabin 28, likely within hours of the initial attack. But this raises another question: why take her at all? If the killers intended to murder her immediately, why not kill her in the cabin along with Sue, John, and Dana? One theory is that Tina was taken because she was a witness. She had seen the killers' faces. She could identify them. So the killers decided to remove her from the scene and dispose of her body elsewhere to avoid leaving additional evidence at cabin 28. But this theory has a flaw. If Tina was killed within hours of being taken, where was her body for 3 years? Tina's remains were found in 1984 in a remote area near Feather Falls, approximately 60 miles from Keddie, but forensic analysis suggested that the remains had only been at that location for a relatively short period, perhaps a few months, not 3 years. This suggests that Tina's body had been moved. The killers may have initially hidden her body somewhere else, perhaps buried it or concealed it in a location they believed would never be discovered. But at some point they returned and moved the body to Feather Falls. Why? Perhaps the original hiding spot had become compromised. Perhaps construction or logging in the area threatened to expose the body. Perhaps the killers became paranoid and decided to move it to a more remote location. Or perhaps there was another reason entirely, one will never know. The role of fear and intimidation. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Keddie case is how fear and intimidation kept witnesses silent for decades. Multiple people who lived in Keddie in 1981 have since admitted that they suspected Marty Smart and Bo Bubede were involved in the murders. But they never came forward. Why? Because they were terrified. Marty had a reputation for violence. He had a temper. He had made threats against people who crossed him. And Bo was even more dangerous. A convicted criminal with a history of assault. One former Keddie resident described the atmosphere in an interview. Everyone knew Marty and Bo were bad news. But no one wanted to be the one to say it. We were afraid. Afraid of what they might do. Afraid that the police wouldn't protect us. And their fears weren't unfounded. The fact that Deputy M, a law enforcement officer, may have been involved in the murders or the cover-up meant that people couldn't even trust the police. Who were we supposed to go to? The resident continued. If the cops were in on it, if they were protecting Marty, then what chance did we have? We would have just been painting targets on our own backs. This culture of fear allowed Marty and Bo to live freely for years. They weren't arrested. They weren't charged. They moved on with their lives while the Sharp family suffered. And when both men eventually died, they took their secrets with them. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Keddie case is how close investigators came to solving it definitively. If only the technology had existed at the time. Blood and DNA evidence collected from cabin 28 in 1981 pointed to the killers. But in 1981, DNA testing as we know it today didn't exist. Investigators could determine blood types, but they couldn't extract DNA profiles. If modern DNA technology had been available in 1981, Marty Smart and Bo Bubede could identified, arrested, and prosecuted within weeks of the murders. But instead, the evidence sat in storage for decades. By the time DNA testing became advanced enough to analyze the samples, significant degradation had occurred. The evidence had been stored improperly. It had been exposed to temperature fluctuations, moisture, and contamination. When investigators finally tested the samples in the 2010s, the results were suggestive but not conclusive. The DNA matched familial markers consistent with Marty and Bo, but it wasn't strong enough to hold up in court as definitive proof. This is the tragedy of cold cases. The answers are often there, buried in the evidence. But by the time the technology exists to analyze it properly, it's too late. As the years passed and the investigation was reopened multiple times, several witnesses changed their stories, either providing new information or recanting earlier statements. One witness, a woman who had lived in cabin 27, initially told investigators in 1981 that she hadn't heard anything unusual on the night of the murders. But in 2014 she came forward with a dramatically different story. She now claimed that she had heard screaming around 1:00 a.m. She said she had heard what sounded like furniture being overturned. She said she had heard a woman's voice crying out for help, but she hadn't called the police. Why not? She explained that she had been afraid. She said her husband had told her to stay out of it, that it was none of their business. She said she had convinced herself it was just a domestic argument, nothing serious. When asked why she was coming forward now, more than 30 years later, she broke down in tears. "I've lived with the guilt every single day," she said. "I should have called someone. Maybe if I had, they would still be alive." Another witness, a teenager who had been walking through Keddie late on the night of April 11, initially told police he hadn't seen anything unusual. But in 2016 he contacted investigators with new information. He said he had seen Marty Smart and Bo Bubid loading something into a vehicle outside cabin 26 around 1:30 a.m. He described the object as being wrapped in blankets and roughly the size of a child. When asked why he hadn't reported this in 1981, he said he had been scared. He said Marty had seen him watching and had told him get lost, in a threatening tone. The teenager had been afraid of retaliation, so he had said nothing when police questioned him the next day. These changing testimonies complicated the investigation. Were the witnesses finally telling the truth after decades of fear? Or were their memories being distorted by time and media coverage of the case? It's impossible to say with certainty. But the pattern was clear: fear had silenced people who might have been able to help solve the case decades earlier. One of the most powerful and heartbreaking testimonies in the entire Keddie case came from Marilyn Smart, Marty's ex-wife. Marilyn had been married to Marty in 1981, though they had separated just weeks before the murders. She had continued to see Marty occasionally, trying to work things out for the sake of their children. On the night of April 11, 1981, Marilyn later claimed she had been at cabin 26 with Marty attempting reconciliation. According to Marilyn, she and Marty had argued that evening. Around 1:00 p.m., she had decided to leave and go stay with a friend. But before she left, Marty had become agitated, pacing around the cabin drinking heavily. Marilyn said she had asked Marty what was wrong. He had mumbled something about Sue Sharp, something about how she thinks she's too good for everyone. Marilyn hadn't thought much of it at the time. Marty often complained about neighbors. She left cabin 26 and went to her friend's house. But here's where Marilyn's testimony becomes crucial. She claimed that around 20 a.m., Marty showed up at her friend's house. He was covered in blood. Marilyn said she had been shocked. She asked Marty what had happened. He told her he had taken care of something, and that she needed to keep her mouth shut if she knew what was good for her. Marilyn said she had been terrified. She had 2 young children with Marty. She was afraid of what he might do if she went to the police, so she said nothing. She left Keddie the next day with her children and tried to forget what she had seen. But she never could. When Marilyn finally came forward in 1988, 7 years after the murders, her testimony was explosive, but it was also problematic. Why had she waited so long to come forward? Could her memory be trusted after 7 years? And why had she continued to protect Marty, even after divorcing him? Marilyn's answers were simple: fear and guilt. "I was afraid for my life," she said through tears during her testimony. "I was afraid for my children. Marty had told me he would kill me if I said anything, and I believed him." She paused, wiping her eyes. "But every day since then, I've thought about Sue Sharp, about her children, about how I could have stopped it, about how my silence made me complicit." Marilyn's testimony added weight to the case against Marty. But without physical evidence to corroborate her claims, prosecutors still couldn't build a strong enough case to bring charges. Understanding who Sue Sharp was, not just as a victim but as a person, is essential to understanding the full tragedy of Keddie. Sue was a survivor long before the night of April 11, 1981. She had grown up in a working-class family on the East Coast. She had married young, too young, some of her friends said, to James Sharp. The marriage had been troubled from the start. James was controlling, he was jealous, he had a temper. Over the years the relationship became increasingly toxic. But Sue stayed, in part because she loved her children and wanted to give them a stable home, and in part because she didn't believe she had any other options. It wasn't until her children were older that Sue finally found the courage to leave. She filed for separation, packed up her 5 kids, and made the cross-country move to California. Friends who knew Sue during this time described her as brave, determined, and fiercely protective of her children. Sue was a fighter, one friend said in an interview. She had been through hell, but she never gave up. She wanted a better life for her kids, and she was willing to do whatever it took to give them that. Sue worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. She cleaned houses. She waitressed. She did whatever was necessary to keep food on the table and a roof over her children's heads. She wasn't filled with money. She struggled with loneliness. She struggled with the weight of being a single mother in a new place where she had no support system. But she loved her children. That's what everyone who knew her said. She loved them fiercely, unconditionally, and without reservation. And in the end, she died trying to protect them. While Sue Sharp was a survivor and a fighter, Marty Smart and Bo Bede were predators. Forensic psychologists who have studied the case believe that Marty exhibited classic signs of a narcissist with violent tendencies. Narcissists like Marty feel entitled to the affection and attention of others. When they are rejected, they experience what psychologists call narcissistic injury, a deep wound to their ego that can trigger intense rage. Sue's rejection of Marty was, in his mind, unforgivable. She had humiliated him. She had made him feel small and powerless. And the only way Marty could reclaim his sense of power was through violence. Bo Bede, on the other hand, was likely a psychopath. He lacked empathy. He had a history of violence. He enjoyed exerting dominance over others. The combination of Marty's narcissistic rage and Bo's psychopathic tendencies created a deadly partnership. Together, they fed off each other's darkness. They encouraged each other's worst impulses, and on the night of April 11, 1981, they unleashed that darkness on an innocent family. The Ketty Cabin murders didn't just destroy the Sharp family. They destroyed the community of Ketty itself. In the years following the murders, the once peaceful resort town became a ghost of what it had been. Families moved away. Businesses closed. The sense of safety that had defined Ketty was gone. People who stayed in Ketty struggled with fear, paranoia, and grief. They looked at their neighbors differently. They locked their doors at night. They taught their children to be wary of strangers. And they carried the weight of knowing that a horrific crime had occurred in their community, and the killers had never been brought to justice. One longtime Ketty resident described the aftermath. It was like a shadow fell over the whole town. People didn't talk about it, but everyone felt it. The innocence was gone. Some residents tried to move on. They organized community events. They tried to rebuild the sense of togetherness that had once defined Ketty. But the shadow remained, even today. More than 40 years later, people in the area still talk about the murders. The case has become part of the town's identity, a dark chapter that can never be fully closed. Over the decades, the Ketty Cabin murders have been the subject of countless media productions, documentaries, podcasts, books, television specials, and online forums. Some of this coverage has been respectful and well-researched. Programs like People Magazine Investigates and 20/20 have featured the case, interviewing family members and investigators and presenting the facts in a straightforward manner. But other coverage has been sensationalistic and exploitative. Some documentaries have focused almost exclusively on the gore and brutality of the murders, using graphic recreations and disturbing imagery to shock viewers. These productions often treat the victims as props in a horror story rather than as real people who suffered and died. Sheila Sharp has spoken out against this type of coverage repeatedly. "When you turn my family's deaths into entertainment, you're disrespecting their memory," she said in one interview. "You're reducing them to nothing more than a shocking story. And that's not who they were." At the same time, Sheila has acknowledged that media coverage has been essential to keeping the case alive. Without the documentaries, without the podcasts, without people talking about the case, it would have been forgotten, she said. So I'm grateful for the media when it's done right, when it treats my family with dignity and respect. The line between raising awareness and exploiting tragedy is a fine one, and in the case of Keddy, that line has been crossed more times than Sheila cares to count. In the age of the internet, cold cases like Keddy have attracted armies of amateur investigators, people who spend hours poring over case files, discussing theories in online forums, and conducting their own research. Some of these amateur sleuths have made valuable contributions. They've uncovered new witnesses. They've identified inconsistencies in the original investigation. They've brought attention to overlooked details. But others have caused harm. Some amateur investigators have harassed people they believe to be suspects. They've spread unfounded rumors. They've accused innocent people without evidence. One man who lived near Keddy in 1981 became the target of online harassment after a true crime blogger identified him as a person of interest, based on nothing more than speculation. The man received threatening messages. His address was posted online. He and his family lived in fear until the blogger finally retracted the accusation. Sheriff Hagwood addressed this issue in a 2017 statement. "We appreciate the public's interest in the Keddy case," he said, "but we need people to understand that amateur investigations can do more harm than good. If you have information, please bring it to law enforcement. Don't take matters into your own hands." Despite these warnings, the online true crime community continues to dissect the Keddy case. Theories are debated, evidence is re-examined, and the line between helpful interest and harmful obsession remains blurry. Cabin 28 itself no longer exists. The structure was demolished in the early 2000s, and the land has since been cleared. But for those who remember, Cabin 28 will always be a symbol of the horror that unfolded there. Some people who visit the site today report feeling an eerie presence. They describe a heaviness in the air, a sense of sadness that permeates the space. Others say they've heard strange sounds, whispers, footsteps, the faint echo of a woman's voice. Whether these experiences are real or the product of overactive imaginations is impossible to say. But one thing is certain: the memory of what happened in Cabin 28 has not faded. The land itself serves as a reminder that evil exists, a reminder that innocent people can be destroyed by that evil, and a reminder that justice, even when delayed, must always be pursued. As we approach the end of this harrowing story, it's important to understand that the Keddy Cabin murders represent more than just an unsolved case. They represent a failure of the justice system, a tragedy that devastated multiple families, and a dark chapter in California's history that continues to haunt everyone it touched. In the years following Sheriff Hagwood's 2016 announcement, investigators continued to work on the case. They continued to analyze evidence. They continued to interview witnesses. They continued to search for that one piece of information that might finally, definitively close the case. And while they never found that smoking gun, that one piece of evidence that could prove beyond all doubt exactly what happened on April 11, 1981, they did manage to piece together a comprehensive picture of the events. Based on all the evidence, all the witness testimonies, and all the forensic analysis, here is what investigators believe happened that night, the night of April 11, 1981, a reconstruction. It was a Saturday evening. Sue Sharp was at home in Cabin 28 with her children. Sheila had left around 8:00 p.m. to sleep over at a friend's house next door. John's friend Dana Wingate had come over to hang out. The younger children, Tina, Ricky, and Greg, were getting ready for bed. The evening was peaceful, normal, unremarkable. Meanwhile, next door in Cabin 26, Marty Smart and Babide were drinking. They had been drinking for hours. Marty was in a dark mood. He had been obsessing over Sue Sharp for weeks. He had made advances. She had rejected him, and the rejection had festered inside him like an infected wound. Bo encouraged Marty's anger. He fed into it. He made crude comments about Sue. He suggested that she needed to be taught a lesson. And as the alcohol flowed and the night grew darker, their conversation turned from bitter complaints to violent fantasies. At some point, investigators believe it was around 11:30 p.m., Marty and Bo decided to act. They may have been joined by a third person. The evidence suggests there was at least one other individual involved, possibly Deputy M, possibly someone else. But for the purposes of this reconstruction, we'll focus on what we know for certain. Marty and Bo went to cabin 28. They brought weapons, a hammer from Marty's garage, knives from Sue's own kitchen. They may have taken them on a previous visit to the cabin, or they may have grabbed them once inside. They knocked on the door of cabin 28. Sue answered. She recognized Marty. He was her neighbor. She may have been wary. Marty had made her uncomfortable in the past, but she didn't perceive him as an immediate threat. She let them in. Once inside, the atmosphere changed immediately. Marty's demeanor shifted. His eyes were dark. His movements were aggressive. Sue likely asked what they wanted, why they were there so late, and then it began. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Marty lunged at Sue with the hammer. The first blow struck her on the side of the head. She fell. She tried to scream, but Bo was already on her, covering her mouth, striking her with his fists. John heard his mother's cries. He was in the living room with Dana. He jumped to his feet and rushed toward his mother. But Marty turned on him. John was 15 years old, tall and strong for his age. He fought back. He swung at Marty. He tried to protect his mother. But he was no match for two grown men armed with weapons. Marty struck John with the hammer. Once, just 3 times. The blows were devastating. John's skull fractured. He fell to his knees, blood pouring from his head. Dana Wingate could run. The front door was just feet away. He could have escaped or helped, but he didn't. Dana tried to defend his friend. He grabbed a lamp and swung it at Bo. He screamed for the attackers to stop. Bo turned on Dana with a knife. He stabbed Dana in the chest. Dana stumbled backward, clutching the wound. But Bo didn't stop. He stabbed Dana again, and the living room had become a slaughterhouse. Sue was on the floor, barely conscious, blood pooling around her head. John was dying, his young life slipping away with every labored breath. Dana, his strength fading with every second. And then from the back bedroom a sound, a small voice. Mommy, Tina. Tina Sharp had been woken by the sounds of the struggle. Tina Sharp had been woken by the sounds of the struggle. She had heard her mother screaming. She had heard the crashes, the thuds, the terrible sounds of violence. She climbed down from her bunk bed and opened the bedroom door. And she saw everything. She saw her mother on the floor covered in blood. She saw her brother John, his face unrecognizable. She saw Dana, the kind teenager who had always been nice to her, slumped against the wall. And she saw the men with the hammer and the knives. Tina screamed. One of the killers, investigators believe it was Bo, grabbed her. He covered her mouth with his hand. She struggled, but she was just a 12-year-old girl. She didn't stand a chance. The killers made a decision in that moment. Tina had seen their faces. She was a witness. She couldn't be allowed to live. But they didn't want to kill her in the cabin. There was already too much blood, too much evidence. They needed to move her. So they wrapped her in a blanket. They carried her out of cabin 28. They put her in a vehicle, possibly Marty's truck, possibly another vehicle if there was a third person involved, and they drove away. Behind them, in cabin 28, Sue Sharp drew her last breath. John Sharp, the brave 15-year-old who had tried to save his mother, died on the floor of the living room. And Dana Wingate, who could have run but chose to fight, bled out near the couch. In the back bedroom, Ricky and Greg remained in their beds. They had heard everything. They had heard the screams, the crashes, the sounds of death. But they were too terrified to move. They pulled the covers over their heads and prayed that the bad men wouldn't come for them. The killers didn't. For reasons we may never fully understand, Marty and Bo left the 2 young boys alive. The killers drove Tina to a remote location. It may have been near Feather Falls, or it may have been somewhere else entirely. They killed her there. The forensic evidence suggests she was struck in the head with a blunt object, likely the same hammer that had killed her mother and brother. Tina Sharp, sweet and gentle Tina who loved animals and left little notes for her mother, was murdered and left in the wilderness. Her body may have been moved several times over the next 3 years. The killers may have returned to check on it, to ensure it hadn't been discovered. And at some point, they moved it to the location where it was finally found in 1984. But by then, Tina had been alone in the woods for 3 years. Her family had spent those years hoping, praying, searching. And when her remains were finally discovered, it was too late for justice. Too late for answers. Too late for anything except grief. When Sheila Sharp opened the door to cabin 28 on the morning of April 12, 1981, and found her family slaughtered, the entire community of Keddie was plunged into a nightmare. News of the murders spread quickly. By midday, everyone in the small mountain community knew what had happened, and everyone was terrified. If this could happen to the Sharp family, a quiet, ordinary family who kept to themselves, then it could happen to anyone. Parents held their children closer. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Doors that had never been locked were now bolted shut. And in cabin 26, just next door to the crime scene, Marty Smart and Bo Bubede watched as police processed the scene. They watched as Sheila Sharp was led away, traumatized and sobbing. They watched as the bodies were carried out in bags. They watched as investigators searched for evidence. And they said nothing. In fact, Marty and Bo stayed in Keddie for several more weeks after the murders. They acted as if nothing had happened. They went about their daily routines. They even spoke to investigators, offering their theories about what might have happened. Marty suggested that the murders might have been committed by transients passing through the area. Bo agreed, saying he had seen suspicious-looking people in the woods a few days before the attack. The investigators, overwhelmed by the scope of the crime and lacking the resources to properly process all the evidence, took their statements and moved on. Marty and Bo had gotten away with it. For nearly 35 years, Marty Smart and Bo Bubede lived with what they had done. Marty moved from place to place, never staying anywhere for long. He drank heavily. His health deteriorated. He had failed relationships. He worked odd jobs. And according to people who knew him in his later years, he was haunted. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. He would talk about the blood and the faces. He would sometimes mention a woman and children, though he never gave specifics. One acquaintance described an incident in the mid-1990s when Marty, drunk and rambling, said something chilling. "I did something once, something terrible, and I can't take it back." When pressed for details, Marty shut down. He refused to elaborate. He just stared into his drink and said nothing more. Bo Bubede, on the other hand, seemed to have no such conscience. People who encountered him over the years described him as cold, detached, and unrepentant. He never expressed remorse. He never hinted at guilt. If Bo was haunted by what he had done, he never showed it. Both men died without ever confessing. Marty in 2000, Bo several years later. They took their secrets to their graves. But the evidence they left behind, the blood, the DNA, the letter, the witness testimonies, told the story they never would. While Marty and Bo went on with their lives, the 3 surviving Sharp children were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered world. Sheila Sharp, who had discovered the bodies, was 14 years old when her life changed forever. She was separated from her younger brothers and sent to live with relatives in another part of California. For years, Sheila struggled with survivor's guilt. She asked herself the same questions over and over. What if she had stayed home that night instead of going to her friend's house? What if she had been there? Could she have done something to stop it? Could she have saved them? Rationally, Sheila knew the answer. She was a 14-year-old girl. She couldn't have fought off 2 grown men with weapons. She would have been killed along with the others. But guilt isn't rational. And Sheila carried that weight for decades. She also struggled with the trauma of what she had seen. The image of her mother's body, of her brother John lying on the floor, haunted her dreams. She developed PTSD. She had nightmares. She couldn't sleep without the lights on. Therapy helped, but it couldn't erase the memories. Sheila has said in interviews that she's learned to live with the pain, but it never truly goes away. There's a part of me that will always be that 14-year-old girl standing in the doorway of cabin 28, she said. That moment is frozen in time. And no matter how much I heal, I can never change what I saw that morning. Ricky Sharp, who was 10 years old on the night of the murders, has lived a quieter life. He's rarely spoken publicly about the case. Friends describe him as deeply private, reserved, and haunted by memories he's never fully processed. Ricky has admitted in the few interviews he's given that he heard the sounds of the attack that night. He heard his mother screaming. He heard the crashes and thuds. He heard everything. And he did nothing. Not because he didn't want to help. Not because he didn't love his mother. But because he was a 10-year-old boy, terrified and frozen in fear. The guilt of that inaction has stayed with him his entire life. Greg Sharp, who was only 5 years old at the time, has the fewest memories of the night itself. But that doesn't mean he escaped unscathed. Greg grew up without his mother, without his sister Tina. He grew up knowing that his family had been ripped apart by an act of unspeakable violence. And he grew up with the knowledge that the people who did it were never held accountable. All 3 surviving Sharp children have had to find ways to live with that reality. And while they've each followed different paths, they all carry the same scars. It's important to remember that the Sharp family wasn't the only one devastated by the Ketty cabin murders. Dana Wingate's family also lost someone they loved that night. Dana was 17 years old. He was a good kid, polite, hardworking, loyal. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was planning to graduate high school the following year. He had dreams of becoming a mechanic. And he died because he refused to abandon his friend. Dana's mother, Marilyn Wingate, was consumed by grief after his death. She struggled to wonder her son had been taken from her, why he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, why he had paid the ultimate price for his loyalty. Marilyn never fully recovered from the loss. She died in the early 2000s, still searching for answers, still mourning her son. Dana's siblings also struggled. They lost their brother, their protector, their friend. And like the Sharp children, they had to live with the knowledge that the killers were never brought to justice. The Wingate family has largely stayed out of the public eye. They've chosen to grieve privately, but their pain is no less real, no less profound than that of the Sharp family. So where does that leave us? Is the Ketty cabin murders case solved? Technically, no. There have been no arrests. There have been no convictions. No one has been held legally accountable for the deaths of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate. But in every other sense, the case is solved. We know who did it. Marty Smart and Bo Bubede killed 4 innocent people in a fit of rage, obsession, and violence points to them. The witness testimonies point to them. The DNA points to them. And Marty's own letter, his cryptic confession about buying love with 4 people's lives, points to them. The only reason they were never arrested is because the original investigation was mishandled. Evidence was lost or destroyed. Witnesses were ignored. And a culture of fear and possible corruption allowed the killers to slip through the cracks. By the time modern forensic technology and determined investigators like Sheriff Hagwood took another look at the case, it was too late. Marty and Bo were already dead. So there will be no trial. No verdict. No day in court where the families can finally hear the words guilty. But there is knowledge. There is understanding. There is the certainty of knowing who did it and why. And for some, that's enough. For others, it will never be enough. The Ketty cabin murders serve as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper investigation, evidence preservation, and accountability in law enforcement. This case should have been solved in 1981. The evidence was there. The suspects were identified early on, but incompetence and possibly corruption allowed the killers to walk free. In the years since, the case has led to reforms in how cold cases are handled. Many states have passed laws requiring better evidence storage. Some have created cold case units specifically dedicated to reviewing unsolved homicides with fresh eyes and new technology. The Ketty case has been cited in training programs for law enforcement, used as an example of what not to do. And while those reforms can't bring back Sue, John, Tina, or Dana, they can help ensure that other families don't suffer the same fate. In 2021, 40 years after the murders, Sheila Sharp gave an interview to a documentary crew filming a retrospective on the case. She was asked how she wanted her family to be remembered. Sheila thought for a long moment before answering. "I want people to remember that my mother was more than a victim," she said. "She was a woman who loved her children. She was brave. She left an abusive marriage and moved across the country to give us a better life. And even though she didn't get to see us grow up, everything she did was for us." She paused. John was my big brother. He was kind and protective. He died trying to save our mom. He was a hero. She wiped her eyes. Tina was the sweetest person I've ever known. She was gentle and loving and innocent. She didn't deserve what happened to her. None of them did. Sheila took a deep breath. And I want people to know that even though the men who did this are dead, even though there was never a trial, justice isn't just about the legal system. Justice is about truth. And the truth is that Marty Smart and Bo Bede murdered my family. The world knows that now. Their names are forever linked to this horrible crime. They'll never be remembered for anything else. She looked directly into the camera. And my family, my mom, John, Tina, and Dana, they'll be remembered for who they were. For the love they gave, for the lives they lived. Not just for how they died. More than 40 years have passed since that terrible night in April 1981. Cabin 28 is gone, demolished and cleared away. The Keddy Resort is a shadow of what it once was. Many of the people who lived the time have moved on or passed away, but the memory remains. The Keddy Cabin murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved cases in California history. The case has been featured in countless documentaries, podcasts, books, and television shows. It has fascinated true crime enthusiasts and horrified casual observers. But beyond the media coverage, beyond the speculation and theories, there is a simple truth. 4 people died on April 11, 1981. 4 innocent people who were loved and missed. 4 people who deserved better than what they got. Sue Sharp deserved to watch her children grow up. She deserved to see Sheila graduate high school. To see Ricky and Greg become men, to see Tina become a young woman. She deserved to live the peaceful life she had worked so hard to build. John Sharp deserved to graduate high school. He deserved to learn a trade, to fall in love, to have a family of his own. He deserved a future. Tina Sharp deserved to grow up. She deserved to follow her dreams, to experience life, to discover who she would become. She deserved to be more than a 12-year-old girl taken from her bed in the middle of the night. And Dana Wingate deserved to live. He deserved to finish high school, to become a mechanic, to build the life he had planned. He deserved more than to die on the floor of a friend's cabin, murdered for the crime of being loyal. They all deserved more. And the fact that the men who took those lives from them were never held accountable in a court of law is a tragedy in itself. As we come to the end of this story, it's impossible not to feel the weight of it all. The senseless violence, the lives cut short, the decades of pain and unanswered questions. The Keddy Cabin murders are a reminder that evil exists in this world. It walks among us. It can hide in the most ordinary places, in a neighbor's cabin, in a friend's smile, in the quiet corners of small mountain towns. But this case is also a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Sheila, Ricky, and Greg Sharp survived. They endured unimaginable trauma, but they kept going. They built lives. They found ways to honor their mother, their brother, their sister. And they never stopped fighting for justice, even when it seemed impossible. Even when the system failed them, even when the killers died before they could be brought to trial. Their strength is a testament to the power of love, and the refusal to let evil have the final word. The world will never forget Sue Sharp, or Tina Sharp, or Dana Wingate. Their names are etched in history now. Their story has been told and retold, and as long as people continue to seek truth and justice, their memories will live on. How could someone do this? How could anyone commit such unspeakable cruelty? We may never fully understand the darkness that drove Marty Smart and Bo Bede to do what they did. But we can remember the light that Sue, John, Tina, and Dana brought to the world. We can honor their memories, and we can ensure that their story is never forgotten. Thank you for listening to this difficult and heartbreaking story. The Keddy Cabin murders are a tragedy that has touched countless lives over the past 4 decades. If this case has affected you, if it's made you think about the fragility of life or the importance of justice, then perhaps some good can come from the telling of it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the case, please leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Your support means everything and helps us continue to share these important stories. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another case. Good night and stay safe.